Hey, what's up, Mr. Ippolito students? This is Mr. Ippolito, and today we're going to learn about the Federalist Papers. So let's go ahead and take a look at them right here. We'll start off with the instructions, which basically kind of set the stage, right? The Federalist Papers, written and published in 1787 and 1788 in several newspapers to persuade New York voters to ratify the proposed Constitution. So what we know is this: the Constitutional Convention met from May until September of 1787. The Constitution was written and done, and now it's just a matter of sending it out to all of the states in the hopes that at least 9 of the 13 would ratify the Constitution. 9 was the magic number in order for the Constitution to take effect and for us to officially become the United States of America under the new Constitution, rejecting the old Articles of Confederation. So the essays were written specifically to convince New York, but really these essays, the intended audience is the entire country, right? Like, we're really trying to sell everyone on the idea of why this Constitution is going to be better. This form of government is going to be better, and it's going to help our country last longer than we would if we remained under the Articles of Confederation. In total, the Federalist Papers consist of 85 essays outlining how this new government would operate and why this type of government was the best choice for the United States of America. So essentially, these essays are arguing we need to ratify this new Constitution because we are going to be a better country. We are going to be a more perfect union as a result of this Constitution. All of the essays were signed Publius, which is a reference to the Roman Republic from ancient Rome. And so meaning the public in Latin, right? They wanted to keep their identities secret at first. And the actual authors of some are under dispute, but the general consensus is that Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of the essays, James Madison wrote 29, and John Jay contributed the remaining 5. So let's go ahead. I want to start off by looking at I want to look at 4 today. The first one I want to take a look at is Federalist 10. And by the way, if we are taking a look, if we're in your study guide, because this may be part of the reason why you're here, is simply to answer these questions on your study guide. So Federalist 10 is about blank, and it's important because blank. So we're going to try to fill in these 4 blanks, and we'll start off with Federalist 10. So if you take a look at the reading here, and you read through these bullet points, and I'm not going to read them point by point, but essentially Federalist 10 is talking about how if you build a union correctly, if you create a country correctly, and we are creating, and James Madison knew this well because James Madison wrote Federalist 10, we are creating a federal republic. Federal meaning we use the federal system, federalism, right? Where you balance power between the state governments and the national governments. Under the Articles of Confederation, way too much power given to the states, according to their belief. And so they're going to try to have a better balance, a stronger national government. And so when you have a well-constructed union, it says, James Madison says, it has the tendency to break and control the violence of faction. And then he goes on to explain what is faction. So a faction is essentially people who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest. Essentially, it's any interest group adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So essentially, it's an interest group that wants to take away your rights as Americans, or just wants to do something that's maybe not in the best interest of the country. So, for example, let's say that you appreciate your right to own a gun, the Second Amendment, and let's say that there is a group, an interest group, a faction that wants to take away your right to own a gun. Here, under the laws of the United States and the Constitution of the United States, it is much more difficult to take away your rights because we built the country that way. We built our government and the Constitution that way to make it more difficult, Madison argues, to take away your rights. Let's use another example, marriage equality. So the LGBTQ plus community for years and years fought for marriage equality, for the right for a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman. And now that has been protected after the Obergefell case in Supreme Court case in 2015, it is much more difficult now for any interest group, if there's a group who says, you know what, we don't think that, we don't believe in this marriage equality stuff. Marriage should be between one man and one woman. It's going to be much more difficult for an interest group like that to try to take the rights away from those Americans who wish to just marry the person that they love. So in our country, under the Constitution, Madison is saying, it's much more difficult for a faction, a group of people united by common interest, to try to take away the rights of other Americans, right? He goes on to say a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points. So what brings these people together? What brings these factions together? A lot of times it is a zeal. It's like they're super passionate about something. Perhaps they're passionate about religion, or they're passionate about government. And sometimes that zeal gets in the way of them thinking, you know what rights am I potentially taking away from other people? So, this can go a lot of different ways. But essentially, Madison argues that the Constitution is good for protecting the rights of others against the dangers of faction, or the mischiefs of faction. And then finally, I'll point out here, it may be concluded that a pure democracy can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. In other words, if we just did straight up democracy, direct democracy like we had in ancient Greece, then it wouldn't work, because then anytime you have a majority, they can vote to take away the rights of the people. For example, in the South, in the American South, for ever since the end of Reconstruction, which you'll learn about a little bit later on, up until the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, a majority of voters in the southern states voted to essentially take away rights of African Americans through programs like segregation and Jim Crow laws that made it much more difficult, if not impossible, for Blacks in the South to be able to vote, to participate in government, to even access equality under the law, to access schools. There were segregated schools and drinking fountains, and seating sections in restaurants, and seating on public buses. And so, again, sometimes when you just have a pure democracy, it's easier for a faction, for a group, to take away the rights of others. That's why we live in a federal republic. Okay, so that was the longest explanation, probably, hopefully. So now we take a look here, and you're like, Mr. Ippolito, just give me the answer. Federalist 10 is about faction, the mischiefs of faction. Basically, any group that wants to get together because they're passionate about a cause or about their beliefs and could potentially take away the rights of other Americans. And it's important because Madison argues that under the Constitution, it makes it much more difficult, not impossible, but it makes it much more difficult for a faction to take away the rights of others. So that's what Federalist 10 is about. Federalist 10 is saying, we're not creating a democracy, a direct democracy, on purpose. We're creating a federal republic to reduce the ill effects of faction. Okay, so that's Federalist 10. Let's move on now to Federalist 51. You're going to be like, Mr. Ippolito, oh, I can't take another explanation like that. Well, Federalist 51 is super easy. It's basically, again, this is James Madison talking about each department should have a will of its own. He's talking about separation of powers. Under this Constitution, we will have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, right? So essentially, he's saying we're doing this because, well, first we divide between two distinct governments, the national government and the state governments, that's federalism, and then portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. So the national government has legislative, executive, judicial. Each of the states, right here in California, we have executive, a governor, and all of the executive departments, right? The DMV is part of the executive branch for California, the Department of Motor Vehicles. They're going to give you a driver's license, hopefully in a couple more years. The legislative branch, that is the California legislature, the Assembly, and the California Senate. And then the state of California has a court system as well, right? So when we divide up power, Madison is saying we're separating not only between national government and state governments, but also among three branches at the national level and at the state levels. It is of great importance in a republic, not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. So in other words, we're creating this Constitution not just to protect us from tyrants or kings, rulers that might want to take our rights away, but also certain parts of the government that might want to try to overshadow other parts. So we're really spreading that power out. Separation of powers and checks and balances. That's what Federalist 51 is all about. So if you're answering this question, Federalist 51 is about separation of powers and checks and balances. And it's important because James Madison is arguing that we're creating this Constitution and spreading out the power so that no one person can get too much power and no one branch or part of the government can get too much power. That's Federalist 51. Okay, we're moving on. See, that was faster. Let's move on now to Federalist 54. This is, Federalist 54 is kind of a shame. And the reason why is because it's on the status of slaves. Essentially, it's about the 3/5 compromise. So in this first bullet point here, and Federalist 54 goes on a lot longer. I just pulled two bullet points that I thought would be relevant. So essentially, we believe this is Alexander Hamilton writing this one. And he's talking about slaves now. In being compelled to labor, not for himself, but for a master. In being vendible, like vendible, you can sell that person by one master to another master. And in being subject at all times to being restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. So the first part of this bullet point, and this is just, you have to understand how horrible it is. And this is something that we're not proud of as a country, right? That we bear this stain of slavery, this system of slavery, and that we're talking about human beings this way. So on the one hand, Hamilton, we believe this is Hamilton writing this, saying, you know what? The fact that we treat them like animals would tend to mean that slaves should be treated as property. However, he goes on to say, in being protected, on the other hand, in his life and his limbs, against the violence of all others, there are laws that protect slaves against being treated, mistreated or treated violently or murdered. Even the master of his labor and his liberty, and in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others. So you can still you can put a slave on trial for committing crimes against others. The slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, not as a part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. So here is one of our founders basically trying to balance, like, how do we treat an enslaved person? Do we treat them like an animal, or do we treat them like a human? And he's essentially arguing, you know what? We sort of treat them like a little bit of both. Therefore, let the compromising expedient, this is like one of those ugly parts of our history, right? Let the compromising expedient of the Constitution be mutually adopted, which regards them as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man. So essentially, we're saying this. We treat them 3/5, we kind of treat them like humans, but 2/5, we treat them like animals. And so for the purposes of representation in Congress, that's how we're going to count them. We're going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. So when we're counting the number of representatives that you, South Carolina, or you, Georgia, or you, Virginia, are allowed to get in Congress, if you have 50,000 slaves in your state, we're going to count them for the purposes of apportionment in the census that happens every 10 years. We're going to count those 50,000 slaves as 30,000 humans, which is horrible. You should never have to do math to figure out how much a human being is worth. But that was the status of enslaved people during that time. And so that's the thrust of Federalist 54. I'm going to let you answer these last two because I've gotten you. I think I've trained you in the first two, so you should be able to say Federalist 54 is about. Say what it's about, and it's important because. And then why is it important to you? Why should it be important to us as Americans, as students of American history and government? Okay. Finally, Federalist 78. Ooh, we saved the best for last. Okay. This for sure we know is Alexander Hamilton writing this. And he's talking about an independent judiciary. In other words, he says in this bullet point, all judges who may be appointed by the United States are to hold their offices during good behavior. During good behavior is code for they can have their offices for life. And then he goes on and he says the judiciary, the judicial system, the court system will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be in a least capacity to annoy or injure them. The executive holds the sword, right? They're the executive branch. They have the power of the military. They're the executive branch. The legislature not only commands the purse, the money, they're in charge of the money, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated. So they decide the money and they make the laws. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse. Judiciary does not control the military. The judiciary does not make laws. It does not control the purse. It doesn't control the money. It may truly be said to neither have force nor will, but merely judgment. In other words, our court system, the federal courts, the Supreme Court of the United States, they don't have the force, the power that the executive and the legislative branches do, but we're giving them the power of judgment. They are the deciders of what the law means. They're the deciders of if there is ever any conflict or controversy. They're going to decide it for us. Therefore, that will afford a strong argument, this final bullet point, for the permanent tenure of judicial offices, since nothing will contribute so much as this to that independent spirit in the judges, which must be essential to this faithful performance of so arduous a duty. See, politicians, presidents, members of Congress, you even look at, state assembly people, even people, who run for local offices, Santa Clarita City Council, they need money in order to run for office. They need political contributions in order to run ads, in order to get out, in order to have a staff to have a campaign staff. So politicians are essentially, if they want to run for re-election, if they want to keep their jobs, they always are campaigning and asking for political donations and having to make deals and having to ask for money. Like, if you ever want to know what a politician's priorities are, follow the money. If they get a donation from an environmental group, well, they might make laws that will, impact the environment in the way that that environmental group wants them to. If a politician gets a donation from the pharmaceutical industry, well, maybe they're going to make laws that make it easier for the pharmaceutical industry to make money. If you're getting donations from the oil industry, well, you're probably going to, if as a politician, you're going to make laws that are favorable to oil and drilling and the oil industry making millions, billions of dollars off of oil. Follow the money. Wherever those donations are going, you follow the money. With judges, if you appoint them for life, they don't ever have to run for office. They don't ever have to worry about election. They don't ever have to worry about campaign contributions or political donations. Judges can have what Alexander Hamilton calls an independent spirit because they are not beholden to anyone. And if you take a look at what's going on, this video I'm recording it December 2020. We're still in the midst of this election controversy where President Trump is trying to, and his legal team are trying to argue that the election was rigged, it was fixed, it was stolen, it was improperly conducted by certain states. And ultimately, and this is what is so strong and powerful about our nation, is it is going to the judicial branch. The court system, the federal court system, the Supreme Court is likely going to weigh in on one or more of these cases. And they are ultimately, once and for all, not everyone may be happy with the result, but we respect and understand that we have an independent judiciary that is beholden to no one. And so when the judicial branch speaks, when they render a judgment, in the words of the Mandalorian, I have spoken, right? That is the final judgment. And so we're more likely to respect that because these judges, they're not bought and paid for by anybody. They're not getting any contributions, nor do they need anybody's vote. They are judges for life. Their job now, for as long as they want it, is to simply make judgments that they think are in the best interest of the United States of America. Okay, so that's Federalist 78, and you can go in here and you now know what it's about, so you can answer that and why it's important. Okay, I hope you learned a little bit more about the Federalist Papers. If you want to learn even more, make sure you watch that YouTube video the video that I shared with the clip from Hamilton. I think that will help you understand more and kind of just have a richer understanding of the process that the founders, the framers of our Constitution went through to try to get this Constitution ratified and why it was so important to them and why it should be so important to us as Americans today. Okay, that's all I have to share. Have a wonderful day and thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.